Hi, welcome back to Max and Dave Horsemanship again today. Lovely day. Not sure exactly what the temperatures are, but it's pretty high teens Celsius, which would be well into the 60s, mid 60s Fahrenheit. Intermittent sun, some clouds, a little bit of a breeze. All in all, it's actually a pretty decent day. Now, I just moved my horse, if you've been keeping track and paying attention to my videos, and I just brought her here. And there's actually only one other horse here. And but still, they got to get to know one another and get used to one another. And, well, I'm going to show you how I go about doing things. My way of doing things, what I think is best. There's a lot of different ways of doing things, getting horses used to one another, new places, and that sort of thing. But I'm going to show you what I do, or what I think is best. And, well, unfortunately for that, I'm going to have to go get a horse and bring her up here, and while the other will follow, and all that stuff. Because right at the moment, they're actually way out in the pasture, and although from here I could zoom in on them, wouldn't make for a very good picture. And not only that, but I would be kind of not real effective as far as what I want to talk about. Because I want to talk about, like I said, new horses, getting used to one another. And what's the best way to go about that? Because like I said, there's a lot of different ways of doing it, but and I'm going to talk about some of them and what I think are the downsides. But I'm going to tell you what I do and what I think is actually best case scenario. And this is going to vary a little bit for some of you, because you're not always going to be able to do it depending on your facilities. That is going to somewhat dictate what you do and how you do it by what's available to you. But I'll tell you my way of doing things that you can probably do in most places. And yeah, that's where the other ones come into being a bit of a problem, is because a lot of the other ways of doing things actually require special facilities to be able to do it. How I do things doesn't really require a whole lot, except lots of space. And, well, most places, if it's good for the horse, will have a sufficient amount of space. Get back in a minute when I go get a horse and talk to you about it. Hey, welcome back. Okay, went and got a couple horses, and hopefully you can see them. The one over there, that's mine, and she's the only one I put a halter on. I just led her up, and the other one followed, because he really likes her. Now, what transpired between these two is not necessarily typical, because right from the get-go, they actually got along pretty good. Well, mine was a little bit of a bag. She'd squeal at him and everything, but there wasn't anything physical going on. He was super happy because he's been alone. He was super happy to see another horse. He came in from the far end of the pasture as soon as he saw her, and immediately tried making friends with her. Maybe a little too much, because she didn't seem really cool about it. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did here and what I think is the best way to get horses knowing one another. Now, these two here, right now, what I did is I actually closed the gate. Okay, there's another gate right over there that you're looking at right now, and I closed that one. Now, normally it doesn't need to be closed. I just closed it for the purpose of this video so that I could keep the horses up here without having to keep them on a halter, because beyond that gate is about 40 acres of pasture. All that land out there, well, just about as far as you can see, yeah, it's all part of the same property. It's not a huge amount, but there's about 40 acres out there, and it's enough that if you got to walk to the far end, it's a fair walk, and it does seem to be quite useful, and gives the horses lots of room to move around on. And yeah, you'll notice there's some cattle out there too. We'll get to that in a minute too. But I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that I like to do. Now, even in the area that they're in right now, it's actually a fairly good size that goes all the way around behind the barn, and you can't see what's on the other side of that. And then there's probably out that direction, connected to this, is about another 2 acres there. Acre two, I don't know how big it is. Whatever, it's good enough, it's decent size. And so even right now, they've actually got a fair bit of room, which is what I want to talk about, is having lots of room, because to me that's the best way. Now you'll see these two are still pretty happy to be together, and that's not typical. You know, sometimes they can, well, it depends on how many horses there are too, and the nature of the horses. There's just a lot of variables. Sometimes, you know, it can get a little rough, and it can actually look really bad, but eventually they'll figure it out where they belong in the herd, and they'll get along. In the case of these two, there's only two of them, so they kind of have to get along. It's in their own best interest, and well, he really likes her, and I've figured out very quickly she actually likes him, even though she doesn't always act like it. She doesn't admit it. She squeals at him a lot, stuff like that. But anywhere he goes, she goes. I watched him the very first day I put her in, when he started walking away and then started trotting and then galloping. She did exactly what he was doing, kept right up to him, following along, and staying about the distance away from him that you see right now. Now, one of the things I want to talk about when it comes to getting horses accustomed to one another, now, like I said, these aren't necessarily typical. They got along pretty good right from the beginning, and they still have their issues once in a while, but for the most part, they actually kind of like each other, and yeah, they hang out together, they stick around together, and they like being together. But one of the secrets I find, now this is, again, I'm saying this is my personal beliefs, is if you give them enough room, even if they don't get along, because one of the big concerns that people have is, you know, injuries, because the horses don't get along, they fight or something like that. And it's usually, you know, I've said this in other videos, not near as bad as it looks. There might be squealing and kicking and biting and all kinds of stuff, but they rarely do much harm. You know, worst case scenario, they might rip a hunk of hair off the other horse or something. You know, but generally, it's not a horrible thing. I've seen some cases where I actually was getting a little concerned because of the animosity, and after about a half an hour of nonstop chasing my horse around, the herd leader, all of a sudden he decided he liked her, and that was it. That was the end of it, and they were best friends forever after. Not this horse, a different one. So what do I suggest? My suggestion is lots of space. And the reason for that is, well, as I was saying, they don't always get along like this. This is actually unusual to see two horses get along this good right off the bat. Very little animosity whatsoever. My mare did a little bit of squealing at first, but there was never any physical contact between the two of them. They got along just fine. She just decided, you know, don't get too friendly with me. He wasn't traumatized or intimidated by her, and well, as you can see, they're right there together, and that's kind of the way they've been from day one. But in the event that the horses don't necessarily get along, you have quite a few of them in particular. The problem seems to be worse the more horses you have, and the secret to that, in my opinion, is give them lots of room. Now, even what I just showed you over that, oh, there she goes, she just squealed at him. He was being a little too friendly with her or something, I don't know. Don't worry about it, I can tell. I know they like each other. I've seen it. There's no physical, nothing going on. Anyhow, I just showed you that little piece, couple acres over there. And even something that size would be adequate, because the secret is, if the horses don't get along, as long as they got lots of room to move, if they don't get along, the lower horse can just get away. It can move away. It's all as simple as that. It can just move away. You know, it's not going to get trapped in a corner or in a small space, that sort of thing. So in my opinion, the best thing to do is just give them lots of room, and the more room they have, the better. And like I said, behind me here, there's about 40 acres out there. Well, goodness sakes, if they don't get along, they got all kinds of room there. They could be at opposite ends, and they could be a long way away from one another if they don't get along, which isn't the case, but If that happened and you were in a situation where some of the horses don't get along, the more room they have, the better, because that's when they will, I've had it happen in a fairly large area one time. One of my horses kind of got driven off by the rest of the herd. He was segregated to the far end of the pasture. Actually, for a few days, I had to carry water out to him because they wouldn't even let him near the water bowl. And then all of a sudden they decided he was okay, he could be part of the herd, and that was the end of it. There was no animosities whatsoever. They just simply said, no, you're not allowed over here. That's it. It wasn't serious. But, there's a lot of variations, different things can happen. Now I want to talk about some of the other things that people do and what I think are not a good idea. Well, there's a couple different ways I've heard of, and one of the most common ones, well, there's two common ones. Some people like to quarantine a new horse to make sure it doesn't have anything that could be transmitted to the rest of the herd. That unfortunately requires facilities that most people don't have. And even some of the ones that do like to quarantine horses actually don't have the right facilities for it, because it means you got to keep the horse in a separate little paddock, pasture, whatever. There's another smaller one over here that could be used for such a thing. Only problem is it's a single fence, which means the horses can actually touch one another over the fence. Proper quarantine facilities actually require, I believe it's a minimum 6 foot between fences. You actually have to have a double fence. So there's no way the horses can touch one another. They can't share a water trough. They cannot share feed. They have to be totally segregated. So that's one of the things a lot of people like to do, and that is strictly for health reasons. It has nothing to do really with the horses learning to get along with one another. But what a lot of people do commonly, oh, they went away. Oh, they went that way. Yeah, they're together. But what a lot of people will commonly do, though, is they will actually separate the horse with a fence. They'll put the new horse in a separate pen, and generally a smaller one, by itself, and it can get to know the other horses over the fence. Well, at least that's the theory. Now, I've seen lots of people do that, and it doesn't necessarily work real well. Usually once they finally get out with the rest of the herd, the same dynamics take place that would have if you just put them out there in the first place. Sometimes they do get kind of used to the place and the other horses a little bit more doing that. But here's the downside, and I've seen and heard of this happening, is if the horses don't get along, which happens, is they might actually even try kicking at one another through the fence. And that can be really bad. And I've seen the end result of that, where a horse is kicking at one another, hit the fence with their foot, whether it's wood or wire or whatever it's made of, it doesn't really matter, they can hurt themselves on it. And the horses did in fact hurt themselves on it, and one actually got injured quite badly, and it was unrideable, and they had to treat it, cold hose and wrap it and all kinds of stuff for an entire year before. That's how bad it was. It was quite bad. They had to treat that horse, and it was unrideable for pretty much a full year before it was back up to snuff. So that's one of the reasons I don't like doing that, and I don't like seeing people do that. It's a very common practice. I don't think it's a safe one. There is a risk of injury to the horses. A lot of people think that a fence is good enough, but you know what? If you get two horses that don't get along, they'll start kicking at one another through the fence. I've seen it happen many times. I've seen them try and bite one another, all kinds of things. If they don't get along, they don't get along. And there's something about a fence that just seems to make the whole situation worse, where they seem to think they really have a need to prove their dominance one way or another because of the silly fence being there, and the fence itself risks injury. That's my opinion, okay? Now, like I said, I think the best thing to do, and there's a number of people that will agree with me on this one too, is simply give them lots of room. And that way, if they don't get along, they can just get away from one another, that's all. Even if the one horse is looking for a fight, the lower horse isn't going to get beat up. he's just going to go away. You know, they've got lots of room. It doesn't matter which way it works, whether it's the new horse or an older one that's been around for a while that, you know, is getting picked on. It can happen either way, you know, depending on the personalities of the horses. But all you got to do is give them lots of room, like we got here, and no problem. So that's always been my first choice. And I've had a few people question that, say, oh, when I bring a new horse, and they go, oh, do you want to put it in a pen for a while? And I go, nope, it's going out in the pasture with the rest of them. They'll figure it out. They'll learn to get along. And it always worked, and with very few injuries of any kind, other than the odd little surface scratch kind of thing that really it's kind of to be expected, and no matter how you go about things, it's probably going to happen. Well, now the cows have moved around a little bit, so there aren't as many to see. Well, actually, I can see the rest of them there, but they're kind of mostly behind a pile of rocks right now. Cow things, you know. But I just thought I'd talk about that too, is proper training and exposure. My horse has never been around cattle before, at least not this one. I've had a few others that were, and they could care less. This one, she has not been around cattle. So, well, I was a little concerned at first. I wasn't sure how that was going to work out. Was she going to get along with them or not? Well, let me tell you about it. Well, I wasn't too sure on how things were going to work out, so I was a little concerned actually when I first put her out there, because there's a bunch of cattle out there. Now, there's not a whole lot, but I figured, not unlike the getting along with horses thing, is if she has any concerns, there's enough room out there for her to move around. Oh, and just a side note, at this particular place, there's actually more than one source of water here for them too, so I figured, you know what, there's grass to graze on out in the pasture, even though it doesn't look super green right now. There's grass out there, and there's a couple of sources of water. So if she doesn't like the cattle and wants to stay away from them, she can stay away from them and still get her needs met. Now, I knew the cattle themselves weren't going to be a huge problem, because there's a horse out there with them anyhow. So they're kind of used to that. But like I said, she hasn't been around cattle. But this is where, again, training, desensitizing, getting them used to new things, strange things, as much as possible, makes a huge difference. And it did with her, because I took her out there, and as soon as I went through this gate with her, because I'm actually outside of the fence right now, I'm on the outside of it, and as soon as we went in there and then went through the second gate, there was this great big cow standing there, and she was a little concerned about it. She was wary. You know what I mean? She kept looking at it. You could tell she thought that thing was something that she should keep an eye on. But she didn't freak out and react. And I attribute that to the fact that we did lots of desensitizing with her and exposed her to as many different things as possible during the time I've had her, even though she's never actually been near a cow. It wasn't a huge deal. I mean, yeah, she was a little bit concerned about them, but now, after a very brief period of time, this is only the second day that she's been here, and even after only a couple of hours, she really didn't care whether or not there was cattle there. Didn't bother her one little bit. She realized that there was lots of room. She was kind of preoccupied with the other horse anyhow. He kept her busy, and she didn't have time to worry about the cattle. So just a couple of things I thought I'd throw out there at you about a horse in a new place, when there's other horses, and in this case cattle as well. And what I think is the best way to get horses getting along. And well, like I said, if you've got proper quarantine facilities where you can actually isolate a new horse from the rest of the herd, where there's no risk of them contacting over a fence or anything like that, if the little area that you're going to keep it in is way off, that's fine. Go ahead and do that. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's a good precaution to take when you don't know the other horse, and you want to make darn sure that it doesn't transmit anything into your herd. That's okay. But a single fence between them, I don't think that's a good idea. I think that's actually a recipe for disaster. It doesn't actually teach them to get along. It might give the horse a little time to get used to a new place a bit, but that's about all. It might bring things down just a notch, but there's always going to be some interactions and conflicts and things like that, depending on the personalities of the various horses and the size of the herd. Whenever you bring a new one in, especially by itself, I have noticed, and this is something I've found rather interesting, is with larger herds, if people bring new horses in pairs or threes or fours or something like that, they kind of seem to create their own little herd, and nobody bothers them. I found that rather interesting. I've seen it happen a few times where new horses coming in were actually in a group, and the rest of the herd didn't seem to give them much concern. It's only when they come in one at a time, that's when there seems to be the biggest issues, where all the other horses have to determine where those horses belong in the herd. And in some cases, the new horse, I've also seen this happen, is the new horse was the concern, where it was a little bit aggressive and had to figure out where it fit in the herd, and it would have a conflict with the other horses. I've seen that before too. And but either way, the situation is still the same. If you give them enough room and there is a conflict, if they don't want to get into an argument with another horse, they can just go away. It's as simple as that. So biggest secret, in my opinion, for new horses getting along with old horses or vice versa, just make sure there's lots of room. Stick them out in a pasture that's big enough that they got room to move away. If there's any problems, if they don't want to have a fight on their hands, if they don't want to have any kind of animosity, if they clearly feel submissive one way or the other, they just go away. Simple as that. So I just thought I'd throw that one out you. It's something I have not talked about before, and seemed quite fitting considering the circumstances. I just finished bringing my horse in here, and she had to get along with a new horse and cattle. And so far, things are going pretty darn good. Have a good day.